Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar from Visit Aberdeenshire. I'm Chris Foy, I'm the Chief Executive, and my role this morning is simply to steer us through proceedings. And in a moment, I'll introduce you to our guest speaker, who I'm sure is far more interesting to listen to than myself. Firstly, some housekeeping. As you're joining us, you're joining on mute with your camera off. There is a Q&A function that you can use to pose questions as we go along. And my colleagues will be collating these. And at the end, Deirdre O'Donnell will be posing those back to myself and to David, our speaker. Some context for today. It goes without saying really how stark the current situation is. And most of you in the audience are living through the direct impact of a loss of business. So you know this all too well. I guess in addition to the sheer global nature of the situation, it's the unknowns and the uncertainty, particularly in timing, on a number of fronts that are the characteristics that are, I suppose, making this crisis stand out in comparison to previous crises that have hit the visitor economies around the world. But there is insight that can be drawn from how markets have recovered in the past and can inform decision-making in the weeks and months ahead. For our part, at Visit Aberdeenshire, we have three priorities at the moment, and the wording of these may change and flex a little bit as we go along, but broadly speaking, we are planning for, right now, to deliver a recovery programme for a new operating environment. Many of you would have responded to our survey last week to help us understand more about the barriers that you face and the type of business support that will be relevant as trading can begin again in the year ahead. Our second priority, and these are not in any particular order, there's just in rotation order, is really to main focus on securing business for the North East in 21 and beyond. And in many ways, that's what we do anyway at this time of year, albeit we're dealing with operators and conference organisers who are facing their own challenges at the moment. And thirdly, really, a high priority, immediate priority will be to drive cash into tourism and hospitality businesses as quickly as an easing of restrictions will allow for, and to sustain this expenditure as we go along. We have outlined marketing activity plan to target those who have the greatest propensity to spend, and that will include local people in the first instance, as soon as hospitality businesses can open. And of course, beyond that, it's absolutely central to what we do to be welcoming back visitors from further afield when the time is right. And that brings us today and today's speaker, David Edwards, who joins us from the plains of southern England down in Wiltshire. You may recall that David was one of our guest speakers at last year's tourism conference. I first worked with David some 15 years ago, I think, at VisitBritain when he was head of research and forecasting, during which time I recall David modelling what a theoretical bird flu outbreak may do to UK tourism. Little did we know at the time what we would be facing in the years to come. David then moved on to a similar role at Visit Jersey and has more recently formed Scattered Clouds, a consultancy with the purpose to really assist the tourism industry in transforming data into insight. He's been working with us here at Visit Aberdeenshire to help us, help you understand more about tourism insights, and more recently to evaluate the impact of our campaign activity. We asked David to join us today to throw some light on the factors that will determine how the coming months may pan out, and to explore what COVID-19 and its aftermath will mean for what David's referring to, and we'll explain more about the three M's: the motivation to travel, money to spend, and means to travel in relation to the North East current and potential future markets. So I will now pass over to David, and I'll reappear later on to help with the Q&A. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning to everyone there. I am now going to endeavour to share my screen with you, which hopefully we will get to the slides. And if I can go into slideshow mode, and from beginning, right, here we go. So very warm welcome from what is a rather chilly morning in the west of Wiltshire. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. It's obviously a shame that I can't be there with you, but we all understand why. So for the next 20-25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about the ingredients of recovery, which I'm calling the 3 M's framework. What are we going to cover? Well, I'm going to begin by providing a brief overview of what the normal tourism picture would look like in the region, and of course now is definitely not normal. Then I'll introduce the 3 M's framework, go on to talk about the actors that will shape the future within that framework, think a little bit about what this might mean for the 4th M, and then we will have a Q&A session, as Chris referred to. And I'm absolutely confident that there will be more questions than there are answers at this stage, but certainly Chris and I will do our best to offer our thoughts. Let's begin then with a look at the components of visitor spending in a typical year, both in the city on the left-hand column and then in the Shire on the right-hand column. And we can see that the yellow chunk of these bars is definitely the largest, and that's the spending that typically comes from what are called tourism day visits. Then we can see that the city certainly has a larger share of its overall visitor spending coming courtesy of inbound overnight tourism than does the Shire. Let's compare the region in total with Great Britain. And what we can glean from this chart is that the region is almost identical to GB as a whole in terms of the share of visitor spending that is attributed to those tourism day visits. Whereas if we look at overnight tourism, we can see that the region is somewhat more reliant upon domestic overnight tourism than is GB as a whole, and slightly less reliant upon inbound tourism than is GB as a whole. Turning our attention to overnight domestic tourism by trip purpose, based on the average over the past 3 years for which there are data. At the top half of the chart, we're looking at the Shire, and at the bottom half, looking at the city. So the clear message we're getting here is that in the more rural parts of the region, when we're looking at domestic overnight tourism, holiday travel really is the predominant generator of trips, but particularly nights and spending. Whereas focusing just on the city, yes, holidays still important, but we can definitely see the bigger shade of yellow here, which are trips that are for business. So within the city area, business tourism accounts for about 40% or so of overall domestic spending. What does this mean? Well, it means that recovery will not just be about what happens to leisure tourism, it will be about what happens to business tourism also. Moving on to inbound tourism to the region and looking at the volume and the proportion of trips for different trip purposes, we can see that both holiday and business travel accounts for between 1/3 and 2/5. And once again, what this means is that business tourism is relatively more important in terms of inbound tourism to the region than it is across the UK as a whole. Where do your inbound visitors come from? Well, you will know this, I'm sure, but very many come from Norway, Germany important, France, the US, Australia, and a scattering of visits from other parts of the world. But it is primarily those Norwegian and German visitors in terms of Europe, and then Americans and Canadians for long haul. Now, you will also know that one of the key determinants of travel, particularly business travel to the region, is what's happening to the price of oil. This is actually showing it in sterling rather than US dollar terms and adjusted for inflation. And what we can see is the absolutely sharp decline that there has been in the past month or so. But what we can also, when we take a really long-term look at trends, is understand that actually for an awful lot of the late 1990s, oil was trading at roughly the same value as it is today. On then to these three essential ingredients of recovery. And as Chris referred to them a short while ago, they are motivation to visit, money to spend, and a means of travel. So in a sense, this is thinking about emotional, it's thinking about financial, and it's thinking about practical, both opportunities and barriers to travel. Starting then with motivation to visit. I have every confidence that people here, around Europe and elsewhere, will continue to value their leisure time. They will not lose the love that people have for being able to do stuff, go on holiday and enjoy themselves. Having looked at an awful lot of research over the years that explores what are the motivators of destination choice, they are many and varied, but one that often shines through is that people want to have fun and laughter when they're away on holiday. But what I guess we are experiencing at the moment is that this is now somewhat tempered by anxiety. And people are perhaps having a changed perception of risk versus reward when they're considering taking a short break or a longer holiday, or indeed just a day out as the weeks and months ahead of us unfold. And those changes in perception of risk versus reward will apply to both the destination choices that people make, the types of accommodation that they consider are right for their stay, and also the activities that they choose to participate in whilst they're away enjoying their leisure time. And now I think this could well end up being quite crucial, is that there is going to be a changed holiday experience, at least for the foreseeable future. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this slide, there are many and varied factors that motivate people to choose destinations. The fun and laughter, but also the opportunity to relax, seeing scenic natural beauty, having lots of things to see and do. But one motivator that really often shines through is the recommendations of friends and relatives. Now, there will be an intrepid band of travellers who, as soon as they're able to, will start going out and doing stuff again. What will be fascinating to understand and experience is what will their take on both the journey to and from the destination be like, and what will their experience in destination be like? Will they come home and say to their friends and relatives, well, it was different to what I'm used to, but yes, it was good, we still had a brilliant time? Or will they come home and say, do you know what, that really didn't do it for me? And in part, that will determine whether or not after that first band of intrepid travellers, lots of people think, okay, I was a bit cautious, but it sounds as though it's going to be okay. Okay, so what will those initial wave of travellers experience? And clearly, destinations that do it well, and we don't quite know what well will look like yet, but destinations that do it well may well outperform those who do it less well. Money to spend. So we've got the motivation to go, but one of the crucial things that you need is some money to spend on a place to stay, food and drink to enjoy, stuff to do. And sorry for being a gloomy Gus, but when it comes to economic stuff, I think that it is true to say the worst is yet to come. We saw yesterday the data from ONS that GDP fell by 2% in Q1. Most people reckon it will be a decline of about 25 to 30% in Q2, and perhaps at best a decline of 10% when we get to full year figures, all of which is based on a whole series of unknowns. But as of now, relatively few people in the UK have actually lost their jobs, because so many people, I think it's 7.5 million, are on the furlough scheme. What will happen though, clearly, is some businesses may not survive, and it is only as things start to return to closer to normal that we will begin to understand what are the longer term economic impacts. But can we take solace in what happened just over a decade ago during the last really big economic calamity, the global financial crash. Certainly then we saw unemployment rise really quite rapidly, but what we also experienced was in 2009 about 10 million more domestic overnight holidays than the year before. So is this a promising prospect for the next year or two? Maybe, but maybe not, because those 10 million extra domestic holidays pretty much exactly mirrors the reduction of 10 million in the number of outbound holidays that were taken by Brits. Why so? Well, primarily it's because of what happened to the value of sterling. It fell from about €1.40 down to about €1.10 in the space of a matter of weeks, which all of a sudden made those really popular outbound holiday destinations such as France, Spain and Italy markedly more expensive. So we're not going to see, we expect, any such dramatic shifts in the value of sterling over the coming weeks and months. Another consideration when we're thinking about this essential ingredient of money is again something of a psychological one, I guess you could argue, but it is the worry that people may well have about booking holidays at the moment in terms of, well, if I have to cancel, will it take me weeks and weeks and weeks to try and get a refund? So that, I think, is another consideration. Now, one of the odd things that is going on is that there is a minority, and it is absolutely a minority of people, but there is definitely a chunk of people out there whose outgoings are being curtailed at the moment because you can't go out and do stuff, but who have been in the fortunate position of they are still working, or indeed even those who are on furlough, if they're receiving 80% of their normal salary and they're not really spending in the way they would be normally spending, they will have perhaps a little bit more disposable income. And the big unknown, of course, is, well, how will they go on to spend that? So you've perhaps got the motivation, you've got the money, but you need to be able to get to a destination if you're going to go on holiday. And clearly here, people are going to be re-evaluating the choices that they make between using a private vehicle and travelling on public transport, whether we're talking longer distance travel, so using aeroplanes and ferries, or whether we're talking more regional, so people who would traditionally have travelled by train, will they be re-evaluating what sorts of journeys they are choosing to make? And clearly at the moment, well, we're not permitted to go on holiday overnight at the moment, but even if we were, the clear instruction is don't use public transport. It seems like an eternity ago, but back at the start of March, Flybe sadly closed up shop, but it will not be the last airline that ceases to fly in 2020. Very many airlines are dramatically trimming their schedules and their networks and their frequencies for when they do return to some form of normality. So there will be literally less choice of flights for potential visitors, be they business or leisure. Now, if you are flying fewer planes and you are either forced to keep middle seats empty, or you have a lower load factor because fewer people are traveling, if you want to make the same amount of money that you were making before, you have to increase fares. So that is a potential risk going forward. And in terms of long haul travel, now we've all had the trolley wheel down the aisle with the chicken or beef question posed to us. That may well be for the foreseeable future a thing of the past, with most airlines who are flying long haul saying you will get a carefully pre-packed snack, even if it's a long haul flight. Now, I think for most people, going 10, 12 hours on aeroplane with effectively no food does not scream, this is a holiday at you. There are also both practical and psychological barriers to travel, and I'll return to some of these in a moment or two, but lots of things that may cause people to rethink the way in which they are going to travel if they are going to go on holiday. And we should not lose sight of the fact that it's not just about getting to the destination, it is also about how do you get around once you're actually at the destination. In more rural areas, absolutely, that can be hiring a car, traveling around, but cities tend to have more of an issue in terms of parking and are perhaps more reliant upon people using public transport. And if both air and ground transport usage is going to be significantly diminished for a protracted period of time, that takes us back to where I began in terms of Flybe will not be the only airline to shut up shop, but it also poses great funding challenges to rail, bus and coach operators. So let me introduce then the cast of actors that will help shape the 3 M's. They are the virus, they are government, both at the national and the local level, the international community, economic activity in its broadest sense, visitor economy businesses, local residents, and then last but certainly not least, visitors. Taking each of those actors in turn and beginning with the virus. I fear here that perhaps collectively as societies, media, government, we've not quite come to terms with the fact that this virus is not about to disappear into the ether as quickly as it arrived. Whilst it is being carried around in a host person or on a surface somewhere, it has just as much potency as it had on day one. There has been lots of optimistic talk about a vaccine, but that is clearly uncertain. And even when, if we do see banner headlines in 6 months' time saying vaccine found, we should not imagine that anytime soon after that will the population at large actually be being vaccinated. We will all monitor the rise and fall of R, because as people start to mingle, then the virus will find it easier to jump from one host to another. So it will very naturally start to increase again, all of which is leading us to this conclusion that this really is here for a protracted period of time. There may well be effective treatments that are discovered which could help mitigate some of the impact. But in a sense, an awful lot comes down to the attitudes that we have in terms of risks versus rewards, not just in terms of tourism activity, but all aspects of life. And this dilemma, if you like, of how risky are we going to be able to reap the rewards of doing normal things applies to governments, applies to businesses, and indeed applies to society. On to the next of our actors, government, national and local. Clearly the UK, the Scottish Government, and indeed then more locally. Here we have issues around what will and won't lockdown measures look like in the weeks and months ahead. That will clearly impact dramatically on tourism flows. Consistency or lack thereof between different parts of the countries may be an added area that causes a degree of confusion and uncertainty. Then we have to think about the longevity of the economic support schemes. Yes, we saw that the furlough scheme is being extended until October. Well, extended at least on its current form until the end of July, and then in some form with business support until October, but will it be needed beyond then? If so, will it continue? So therefore, governments have to think about, well, does this just mean higher borrowing? Does it mean higher taxes? Does it mean both? Or will it put renewed pressure over not just the coming weeks and months, but the really longer term on public spending? And what does that mean for all of those tourism assets that destinations have? The international community, and I reckon it's probably fair to say it's not been its finest hour. And whether we're talking international organisations or individual governments, we have not necessarily seen the degree of singing from the same hymn sheet as would be beneficial. And this, of course, then puts pressure on internationalism, which may well have impacts not just for leisure travel, but also on business tourism in terms of the degree of trading that goes on. Now, this is a time when we really want a coordinated international approach towards travel protocols. The risk is that we will see a scattergun approach. And this applies to what are called government advisories. So at the moment, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is saying, do not travel overseas. That, of course, means that if you choose to ignore that advice and go, your insurance probably won't be valid. So advisories matter. Then there are those uncertainties regarding, well, what temperature checks will be imposed and what actually will happen to you if you're abroad and you fail a temperature check. Will you be looked after, or will that cost you money? Will you be able to claim on your insurance? Then there are talk of different countries having different apps and immunity passports. There's, as we've all clearly aware, the risk that governments will decide that, well, we have got our internal rate of communication of the virus down, but we want to cease importation, therefore we're going to impose quarantine, which largely does put the brakes on any form of international travel, whether it's leisure or business. And then there are those more prosaic issues of, well, what actually are the rules about face coverings? Economic activities. So there will, by the end of 2020, be fewer business entities in the UK than there were at the start of 2020. There will almost certainly, once the furlough scheme starts to taper off, be higher unemployment than there was. We've not heard very much about this as yet, but I suggest that it may well come to the fore that there will be inflationary pressures as those businesses that have survived discover that they have a whole host of new operational requirements that they need to adhere to. Their costs will have increased. And if they're going to survive for the long term, that probably means having to put up prices. So inflation may well be an issue. However, one thing that may stay at a relatively low price is the price of oil, because it doesn't look likely that the amount of economic activity that was around in 2019 globally will return in the short to medium term. Then there's this thing called the paradox of thrift. Businesses that do survive will be so focused in the first few months and year or so of returning to normality to rebuild their balance sheet, they probably won't be thinking about investing in new stuff, new ideas, new tech, new capital. That then clearly puts pressure on the supply chain that would normally be delivering all of those services and goods, which is why I am suspecting that the economic impact for this will last for much longer than people perhaps a few months ago were imagining. There will not be a V-shaped recovery, I would argue. We've also seen, obviously, a great growth in home working rather than commuting. This matters for many retail businesses in town and city centres, but also the wider hospitality industry in terms of people just going out for food and drink at lunchtime, but also after work in the evening, going to the pub, going to a local cinema. We're also seeing a step change in the use of technology for communicating on a B2B level. And whilst there will be a return to face-to-face and all those sorts of things to a degree, I really think that there has been this step change in the use of technology, which potentially has a long-term impact on the overall volume of business travel that we see. Visitor economy businesses, well, they're going to see lower demand. A couple of weeks ago, the United Nations World Tourism Organization put out a prediction that globally, the volume of international trips will fall between 58% and 78% in 2020. We're also going to see businesses having to restrict their supply, whether they're restaurants, whether they're visitor attractions, whether they're convention venues. And there will be a whole host of new operational challenges, some of which are listed in small fonts there, all of which means there will be great question marks, as you know better than I, frankly, about is it going to be worth opening given the lower demand and given the restrictions on supply, until we understand what will the new equilibrium between demand and supply actually look like. Throw into the mix the fact that we could well find that we are, as visitor economy businesses, catering for different visitors or even if it's the same types of visitors we had before, they may well be behaving in ways that they didn't used to behave. There are, of course, reputational issues, going back to that whole word of mouth, and businesses that get this right will probably do better than businesses that get it wrong. One of the things that emerged from research carried out by the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions a couple of weeks ago was that consumers are quite eager to start going back to visitor attractions, but they fully expect those attractions to be able to enforce social distancing. They expect the staff at visitor attractions to be able to effectively police the public in behaving appropriately. So that poses a whole new skill set challenge, if you like, for many visitor economy businesses. Local residents. Well, yes, there will be income pressure, and that may well narrow travel horizons, which means people may think, yeah, let's do stuff locally. So that could be a positive. We've talked about the apprehension in terms of traveling. So that again may well make people think, yeah, let's actually do things on a local basis. So again, potentially a positive. But will people think, do you know what? We're going to get a takeaway rather than eat in. So even if they're apprehensive about mingling in their local community, might this require aspects of the visitor economy to change the way in which they do business? Now, I'm very confident that this would not be an issue in Aberdeen or Aberdeenshire, but clearly we have seen in parts of the UK lots of murmurings from local communities that they really don't want to see visitors anytime soon. That then could be a challenge in terms of communications and how do we ensure that that warm welcome the visitors want is actually there. On then to visitors. So they will almost certainly in the next period be seeking destinations that they perceive to be as not too crowded. They will also be reevaluating the type of accommodation they're thinking about. The whole cabin in the woods idea suddenly looks an awful lot more appealing, perhaps, than a buffet breakfast counter. Then there are the transport options that we've touched on and how people are going to reassess those. And you will have seen in, again, small font and in yellow, I'm saying, well, these are all what you might term features of a destination. And now most marketers for a period of time have said, actually, features, yes, they're important, but what really matters are the benefits that you will get from a destination. How will you feel when you go somewhere? But it's, I think, fair to say that features have actually grown in importance over the past few weeks. However, that doesn't mean to say we can forget about the benefits that we have to describe to potential visitors, amongst which value for money is absolutely foremost, which is going to be ever more challenging given those potential inflationary pressures that I've alluded to. People will still want that warm welcome. We shouldn't forget that people will want to be made to feel, yep, I'm enjoying being here. People are making me feel warm and welcome, whether that's frontline tourism staff or whether it's the public at large. And ultimately, they will want to have a memorable, happy, enjoyable experience in the destination. What's happening to consumer confidence? Because confidence really matters in terms of how people choose to spend their leisure time when they again have the freedom to do so. Well, we can see that dramatic decline with the April data over on the right-hand side of the chart. But what you can perhaps also see is, maybe a little bit surprisingly, is that at least at the end of April, UK consumer confidence was still slightly more upbeat than it had been in the depths of the global financial crisis back in 2008-9. When I show a line chart, you always want to say, well, what do the next 6 months look like? And we don't know until we've lived through them. That clearly is one of the big uncertainties. Now, I'm not going to go into this chart in great detail, but so the fourth M is markets. This is not a forecast. This is purely based on thinking about those 3 M's and those actors. What might tourism look like in terms of different markets? Which are the most promising? Which are the least promising? And I've got 3 columns there looking at summer 2020, autumn this year through to spring of next year, and then summer of 2021. All of this supposes that the virus will still be with us, but that at lower levels than it has been over the past few weeks, which of course we don't know will be the case. But and we will be sharing these slides with you, but what I'm effectively saying here is that there are some markets that are really quite promising. There's day trippers, locals, and there are those that are perhaps not really very promising in the short term for some of the reasons we have discussed. Hopefully that wasn't more than about 25 minutes. I'm now going to hand back to Chris for a Q&A session, but if you have been, thank you for listening. So Chris, back over to you.
David, thank you very much. Very enlightening. I think many of us will want to ponder the final slide when we share the deck around, and those who wish to review the presentation later on. As I say, many uncertainties. I think that's going to be the main characteristic of our way forward. But I think, well, I certainly have taken quite a lot from that. Now, are there any questions that you'd like to pose? Perhaps I can invite Deirdre O'Donnell, who's the Insights and Evaluation Manager at Visit Aberdeenshire, to take the helm now and perhaps give us a starter or two for 10 to get us going.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to David for a very stimulating presentation. We haven't had any questions coming through the Q&A at the moment, so just to highlight, if you'd like to ask a question live at this stage, could you use the raise hand function? If you're not sure where that is, you click on the participants list and you should see that you have options there. If you wish to raise a live question at this stage, click the raise hand function and we can take live questions as well. And we have a raised hand from Wendy Cobbin, so if Wendy could be unmuted and allowed to ask her question, that would be great. You can go ahead, Wendy, you're unmuted.
Hello, it's actually her husband, David. I'm sitting beside her. We're both listening to the seminar. But we are based out in Ballater, obviously, in the heart of Royal Deeside, and I was interested by a couple of comments near the end there about the situation with visitors being made welcome once the restrictions start to lift, because out here in Ballater, we are hugely reliant on the tourist trade. You know, we've got a gift shop in the middle of the village, for instance, and without tourist trade, we won't be able to function at all. What we have been concerned about, and this is where I hope Visit Aberdeenshire will assist the villages like Ballater in terms of how to market our tourist trade in the future as we come out of this situation, because there have been very vocal social media comments made up here about anybody attempting to come anywhere near Ballater during the lockdown. Now, whilst I appreciate the sentiment of that, people want to remain safe and healthy. What I would be concerned about is that after the restrictions are lifted and people are legitimately allowed to come and visit Ballater, that we try and ensure that these negative messages start to diminish or cease altogether, because we can't afford for visitors and tourists to get the message from Royal Deeside or Ballater that they're not welcome here. And it, perhaps part of that issue will be a strong marketing campaign to say the exact opposite, in fact, that the tourist trade is welcome here and the businesses are welcome visitors in the future. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Thanks, David. Chris, can I hand over to you to respond initially?
Yeah, very happy to take that, and thank you very much for your question there and comments. It's something which is it's coming up for discussions, not just in our part of the world, but in with other destinations around Scotland, the UK, and in Europe and beyond. The important factor of the community welcome of visitors is that third wheel beyond simply supply and demand. And I think David was talking earlier on about the importance of assurance, about the advocacy, about the confidence of visitors that equally applies to people in host communities as well. I guess it's not necessarily a straightforward one to crack. I think it's going to take quite a team effort of us as a destination, and indeed local businesses in communities, to articulate the obviously the importance of that warm welcome and the great experience that David has just referred to. And we're very keen to discuss ways in which this can be approached in the coming weeks with local businesses, with local tourism associations, to provide that assurance to locals as well as to visitors that the importance of the visitor economy for the long-term sustainability of communities who rely so heavily on tourism. So it's certainly high on our agenda as we go through discussion with business, with tourism associations over the coming weeks. So I'm very happy to pick up conversation with you, and indeed anybody else who has some really good ideas about how we can give reassurance to local communities who perhaps are less directly aware of the impact of tourism on their hometowns.
That's great, thanks Chris. We have a couple more raised hands, so if you do wish to ask a question, just click the raise hand function. Vivian, Ray, hopefully you're unmuted and ready to ask a question.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, David, for a really insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I noticed on one of the slides there regarding the day trippers come next summer, 2021, was sort of sitting at a neutral position, if you like. I'm just interested to hear thoughts on projections forward for events next year. With in mind, I'm involved with the Scottish Traditional Boat Festival in Portsoy and Cornhill Highland Games and things. And obviously preparations for large-scale events like those start, within the next couple of months. We don't really want to find ourselves in a situation where we have this year where we've put a lot of work in and then sadly had to cancel quite near the end. But also as well, taking into account something that was mentioned in the first question, is that these events are based in smaller towns and villages, and there is concern from the local communities in bringing in up to 16,000 people in the event of the small boat festival, and how that will be perceived by the local community, and the risks that may well be there still come this time next year.
Thanks, Vivian. So I'll effectively try to address that. I guess on the positive side, what you're talking about there is an event that would primarily be outdoors, and I think outdoor-based events are probably going to be viewed with less apprehension than indoor events by those who may potentially be thinking of attending them. So in that sense, that's a positive. And hopefully by summer or spring of 2021, as I alluded to, we will at least be managing the virus at a lower level than it has been, and people will perhaps start to become more willing to do things by next year than they are willing to do those things this year, because they have just learnt all of those new social distancing behaviours, and will start to think, actually, I can still go out and enjoy myself and do things. But if there is a miracle vaccine or a miracle cure, or the virus disappears, which I don't think is going to happen, then we should suppose that 2021 would be like 2020, like 2019. But it is probably going to be that middle road, whereby the virus is still here, people are learning to adapt to life with it. We'll still want to get all of the enjoyment, because certainly festivals and events are a way of really showcasing local crafts, local talent, all sorts of things, and visitors do absolutely love them, and they bring a lot of economic value to local communities. But they can also help build that sense of place, that an area has delivered this brilliant event for people both who live locally and who come to visit from outside, which is a woolly way of saying, yes, I would still stick with my neutral for people travelling for events in 2021, purely because of those balance of unknowns, if you like, in terms of where will the virus be. But on the upside, outdoor type of events where people can more easily spread out, I think will perhaps fare better than those in people's minds will involve being in an indoor environment with lots of other people.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks, David. Thanks, Vivian. And next up, Wendy Cobbin. If we can unmute to Wendy, and we'll take your question. Thanks.
Do you mean me? I'm Janet Hunter.
Oh, sorry, Janet. Yes, no, we've got the order on my list has changed. Let's go with yourself first then. Thank you.
Sorry, the clue was in you were allowing me to unmute. I was very interested in your comments about the motivation to travel and the idea of the intrepid travellers perhaps taking on a new experience and trying something, and then the impact of their recommendation to friends and family. We're already all very used to rating experiences, places we stay, etc., etc. And most of us, I imagine, take some notice of some reviews. Do you see the idea of individuals influencing other people's choices as something different, and if you like, more important than the, what you say, currently traditional ways of rating and reviewing a destination?
Okay, thanks, Janet. That's a really interesting question, because it effectively gets at the crux of the fact that there are two different things going on. One is the recommendations that are the much more traditional recommendations. So what we hear from our friends, our relatives, our work colleagues, that really first-hand recommendation, and just even if it's not meant as a recommendation, just the way in which we speak about an experience that we have had when we've been away for a short break or a holiday. So that, I think, will be the most immediate impact that those intrepid travellers have. What do they literally say to their network, if you like, people who know them personally? And then you're absolutely right that over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the rise and rise of the TripAdvisor type of review. Those are clearly going to take on a new aspect, because there will, I am fairly confident, be those people who post a negative review because they were forced to wear a face mask, they were forced to social distance. Equally, there will be people who will post a negative review because they weren't forced to do that. So you will have perhaps people who are very risk averse and expect the hospitality and tourism industry to effectively require society to adopt these new behaviours, whereas there will also be an element of people who think the risk to me is very low. I want to carry on behaving in the way that I did. I don't want to be told what to do. So I'm sure many of us will have seen those stark statistics that thus far 2 people aged under 15 out of a population of 10 million have tragically died, but it's 2 out of 10 million in the UK, whereas in the space of 4 weeks, 1% of all over 90s in the UK have died of COVID. So clearly there is a different risk at different age levels, and lots of other factors also. Over time, what we might see is people become more aware of their personal risk, and we may well discover that there will be those who are saying, I want to do this, I accept that there's a risk, I believe it's small for me. And that will then start to feed through to the sorts of reviews that we get. So it's going to be really tricky for tourism businesses. And I guess a golden rule is any tourism business, whether you get a good or a medium or an indifferent review, responds to it, because that shows engagement. But it will be really challenging as some visitors are complaining about new behaviours that are being imposed on them, and others perhaps are complaining about not having those behaviours imposed on other visitors.
That's great. Thanks very much, David. And if my order is right this time, next up is Wendy Clements with a question.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I've really enjoyed it as well. My question is, I've been approached by key workers looking for self-catering accommodation, which is what I've got. And I'm wondering exactly what the guidance is on taking this. I know initially Nicola Sturgeon said that self-catering and hotels, all businesses should close. I can't actually find the guidance on whether I am allowed to do this. And I'm also a little bit concerned that it could affect my eligibility for the support fund if I do take them. And again, the attitude to, or from other people in the community. Anybody who has asked me how I'm doing or whatever, I have sort of said, oh, there's a possibility of taking key workers, and really trying to make sure that people know that I'm not just letting anyone into my cottages, you know, that I am taking necessary precautions and trying to make sure people out there do know that as well. But yeah, I'm still very worried about whether I should be taking key workers or not.
Wendy, thanks for the question. I'm not fully qualified to give you a very detailed answer, but I'm aware that this has been an issue in many communities. But I'm also aware that there are a number of accommodation providers in Aberdeen and around Aberdeen Airport and elsewhere who are trading because they are accommodating key workers in various sectors. Perhaps if we can do a little dig around and see if there's any pointer signposting we can give you for definitive advice, that would be the best approach rather than to speculate on it at the moment. But I think you make a very good point there about the perception within the communities of key workers staying in accommodation in tourist areas, and that comes back to the point earlier on about reassuring communities as we open up. So perhaps if we can have a look around and in the follow-up that we do, if we can put a link or some signposting that gives you hopefully some more definitive advice than what we can speculate on at the moment, we'll take it forward in that way.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Chris. Next up with a question is Linda Cow.
Hi, it's Douglas Cow.
Hi, Douglas.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thanks, David, for fantastic information. Based on David's last slide on markets, it indicates that there may be a move, an increase in demand for self-catering accommodation over the next few years, and a move away from more hotel accommodation where there are crowds of guests there. Am I right in saying that that's what your slide is saying, David?
Yes, with a bit of a caveat in that my reading of the psyche of people at the moment thinking about trips that they might be taking over the coming weeks and months, yes, without the caveat. As we move into 2021 and beyond, obviously we've become slightly more uncertain about, will people think, do you know what, actually there are advantages to going back to staying in hotels compared to self-catering? Don't know, but I'm reasonably confident as a prediction at the moment that interest in self-catering, so people can pack up their own car, drive to somewhere, get their own food and drink prepared, and not having to do that risky, in quotes, mingling with people. I can absolutely see that acting as a positive for people showing an interest in self-catering accommodation. Now, I guess one of the other unknowns is that a market which would be being extracted from people who would traditionally have stayed in hotels, or is that a market of people who would traditionally have gone abroad and done self-catering, or is it a completely new market? So yes, I'm confident that self-catering will be more perceived to be more appealing over the coming period. And I also think that people will, as they start to think, do I want to stay in a hotel? That involves going in those lifts, doesn't it? That involves having to sort of be in corridors with lots of people I don't know. So from the psychology, you can certainly see why self-catering is going to perhaps feel more appealing in the coming months than the more formal serviced accommodation. But again, as I said when I first presented the slide, those are not forecasts. Those are my best view, if you like, in terms of where are people's mindsets as of now.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. And next is a question from Simon Blackett. Are you there, Simon?
Sorry about that. I've got you now.
Okay,
Hello?
great. Thanks, Simon. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, David, that was a brilliant presentation and excellent to hear about on a much wider scheme. My question is really following up from David in Ballater, was about managing expectations. I want you to imagine it's a warm weekend in the middle of the summer. People are beginning to say, actually, we want to go out. Too many folk descending on Ballater or the Grampian Trance Museum or Balmoral if it's open, and actually being turned away or frustrated in queues and things like that. Obviously there are opportunities, booking online, time tickets and things like that, and looking at websites. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to have lots of folk milling about looking for something to do or somewhere to go or somewhere to eat. And so my question really to David is about, has he got any ideas about how we can manage expectations?
I think we need to recognise that there will be pinch points, whether that's in your neck of the woods, in the Lake District, in Cornwall. There will absolutely be media shots of lots of people trying to do something on a first warm, sunny weekend when some of the restrictions are lifted. But I think for most people, they will travel relatively locally in the first instance. However, what I guess as an industry, particularly in relation to attractions, there will need to be more communication that either we are encouraging or we are requiring timed ticketing to be booked online in advance, such that queues can be managed and crowds can be managed. So I think those attractions that are used to large clumps of people arriving in one go are really perhaps going to have to be quite fleet of foot and find ways of managing the expectations of visitors and communicating through their CRM systems, through their local tourist boards, through other trade associations, that you can't perhaps just turn up when you feel like. There is going to be this requirement for people to pre-book. On a more positive note for attractions, one of the other insights that came out from the ALVA, Association of Leading Visitor Attractions, consumer research, was that consumers do not expect that attractions will lower their prices, or they're quite happy that attractions maintain normal prices. Then there's not a belief, oh, well, to get me back, you have to lower your prices. What people are saying is, to get me back, you have to demonstrate that you are delivering those social distancing measures. So in a sense, that is a positive, because consumers aren't saying you're going to have to discount. What they're saying is, you're going to have to demonstrate to me that you haven't just got a plaque on the wall that says you clean everything every hour. I have to feel safe when I'm visiting your attraction. But there will be those pinch points, unfortunately, particularly perhaps places that are not attractions per se. They are beauty spots, to use the phrase that we hear so often, and people perhaps congregating there. But ultimately, we will have to rely on the common sense of the public to behave in a responsible manner.
Simon, if I may just add to that, Janet will be aware of this from discussions in the National Park over recent days. The visitor management, both in the park and beyond, is going to be quite critical as restrictions unlock. And I think there's an important positive part, motivational part of that visitor management message that goes beyond simply a wagging finger, and certainly something that we're considering as part of the promotional activity that we can take forward. Obviously, a 3-mile queue to get down to Loch Mick is not only not particularly nice for the people sitting in cars or the environment around them, but ideally those people could be economically active somewhere else within the region. So I'm certainly seeing an important part in coming weeks, months, of particularly when we're talking to local people, to really remind people of the great breadth and spread of outdoor experiences and other experiences that exist within the city and Shire. And we all will have a role to play in that, and I see that's a particularly important part of the recovery campaign that we will lead, talking to local people, is to encourage the spread around the region and to discover places perhaps you haven't been to for a few years, rather than just rushing back to the beauty spots that you've been missing so far this summer. So a lot of work to do on that, I think, but I think quite a positive message that we can put out, as well as a visitor management message as well.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, David. And thanks, Simon, for the question. Our final question is from Rebecca Wilson.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I've got 2 questions actually. The first one's a financial one. We were obviously given a grant from the government for this small, well, I got a small grant, 10,000, some people would have got 25,000. But as our industry is probably going to be hit a lot harder than some of the other industries, and this will go on for longer. I know already, like estate agents and garden centres are reopening in England, and garden centres in Wales as well. Do you think, is there a push to get government to pay an additional grant for hospitality? And the other question was an operational one. Obviously, we'll have to be COVID safe when we start operating again. Is the onus on the owners to do a risk assessment and work out what they need to do, or will there be guidelines coming out? For example, I have self-catering accommodation, and to decontaminate between guests all the soft furnishings, I don't know if I should be having additional days in between changeovers, or be using these ultraviolet scan arrays that you can put over all your furniture, things like this. So those are the 2 questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. I think a financial and operational question that perhaps, Chris, you probably can't answer in detail, but could you touch on both of those for Rebecca?
I can, yes. I mean, it's a very, very valid questions, and I know that these are issues that are day in, day out, representative bodies such as the Scottish Tourism Alliance and UK Hospitality are making representations to both governments about the unique characteristics of the tourism and hospitality sector, and how support needs to be tailored to suit the particular sector. And obviously the changes to the furlough scheme, flexibility within the furlough scheme that's been alluded to by the Chancellor earlier this week, has been one of the points that has been lobbied quite hard on by representative bodies who really see the challenges that are going to be faced within the sector. So I think there's still there clearly is still some journey to go, some way to go before we get something more definitive there. On the advice, obviously this is going to be absolutely critical, a literal hygiene factor for businesses to take into account. Again, bodies like UK Hospitality are taking proposals to government as to how the sector can accommodate maintaining a very high standards, and what changes may need to be made. Now, I think that's quite positive that it is coming bottom up from people within the hospitality business to advise government, rather than sitting back and waiting for government to arbitrarily declare how things should be done. Now, obviously, health and safety executive and all kind of other environmental health statutory areas will need to come into play here. But I think you are one of many thousands of businesses of all scales within hospitality who are desperately going to need that advice to work out how to reopen and what the financial impact of reopening will be. So making sure that that information is relayed as widely and clearly as possible is going to be highly important in the coming weeks and months as we seek clarity. So I think you speak on behalf of many people with that question.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rebecca, for that final question. Again, David, a stimulating session which resulted in many questions, and as you said at the beginning, quite often more questions than answers, but you both gave some very eloquent and sound responses there. Thank you. And lots of discussion coming through in the Q&A. I'd just like to hand back to Chris to wrap up the webinar. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to sort of echo your comments. Thank you to David. Before I go any further, I have posted on the chat, on the Q&A, the link to, sorry, am I muted? No, I'm not, sorry, Karen. I posted a link to Visit Scotland's COVID-19 page, very useful central depository of information on different schemes that exist, both Scottish Government and UK Government schemes that may help you, some of you who are writing questions about some of the potential ambiguity in schemes. So that hopefully will be a useful bit of signposting. David, thank you once again for joining us, this time 500 miles away rather than on the stage at the Music Hall as we were last year. As ever, very insightful, a lot of food for thought, no doubt. A lot of the questions that you've posed and some of the forecasting in there will evolve as there's more certainty and more knowledge about how the industry will come out of this and how consumer behaviour will change. And I think you've given us a very clear framework there around, as you say, the key actors and factors that will influence the return. So thank you once again, David, and thank you all for taking an hour out this morning to join us and for all of your contributions to what was quite a stimulating discussion. And we look forward to hosting follow-on webinars in the coming weeks and months to keep local businesses engaged, all part of a recovery programme that we're putting together that will have a number of strands to it. So thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully in reality fairly soon.